Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Helgo. This is the nervous system and chapter 9. And we again will be studying the nervous system. Okay, what about Sue? In class, we are going to look on page 190 and we'll need narrators and Dr. Jensen to figure out what's going on with Sue. And since it is the nervous system, we're going to be using your nervous system intermittently throughout the lecture notes. So brain teaser number 1. If you were running a race and you passed the person in second place, what place would you be in now? So pause for a second and write down the answer. Second, did you get it right? So we're going to start with an overview of the nervous system. So the nervous system is the control center of the body. The nervous system's job, it must detect and be able to respond to change because your body has to be able to detect change and respond to change. So the central nervous system, which we're going to learn is your brain and your spinal cord, organizes all this information and interprets all this information, and it has to do something to respond to the change. So it sends commands out to the body as it responds to the changes. So the commands are sent out to the body as it responds to changes. And how is this information sent? Information is sent to and from the brain and the spinal cord through the body's nerves. So what are the functions of the nervous system? The functions of the nervous system are, it's a control center for all body activities, and it must respond and adapt to changes that occur both inside and outside the body. And as you can see here, you have the brain and the spinal cord, and then there would be nerves radiating out from the spinal cord and then also the brain. So some things that your body has to respond to are pain, like, oh, that stove is hot. I need to do something. I need to remove the hand, which we know would result in a contracting of some muscles, and we learned about how that happens last chapter. Temperature, we know that your body needs to maintain a constant temperature. So if not, your body is not in homeostasis and you get to be in big trouble and the enzymes denature and you could die. Also blood sugar levels. We know that we need to maintain good blood sugar levels so that our cells all have the glucose they need to do ATP and to do all of their jobs. So there are different structures in the nervous system and we divide them up that way by their anatomy. The first division is the central nervous system, and that includes the brain and the spinal cord. The other division is the peripheral nervous system, and that consists all of the nerves in the rest of the body. There are two categories of nerves, the cranial nerves, which carry impulses to and from the brain, and the spinal nerves, which carry messages to and from the spinal column. And there's a nice picture on page 192 of these nerves. So besides just two different structures or two different divisions of the nervous system, we can divide the nervous system by its functions. So we take the peripheral nervous system and we divide it up even more. So we divide the peripheral nervous system into the somatic nervous system, which is under voluntary control. So this controls your skeletal muscles. So if I asked you to raise your right hand, your somatic nervous system of the peripheral nervous system would be involved in that. The other category of the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, and this is the opposite. It's under involuntary control. So it is going to control things you don't usually think about. All the smooth muscle, like your intestines and blood vessels, cardiac muscle, so beating the heart, and glands, like the thyroid gland or the hypothalamus. So the autonomic nervous system is divided 2 more times into sympathetic and the parasympathetic autonomic division. So let's talk about the 2 divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And if you remember, they're both part of the peripheral nervous system. So there is the sympathetic nervous system, sympathetic division of the nervous system, and the parasympathetic division. So the sympathetic tends to be excitatory, whereas the parasympathetic is the opposite. It's associated with resting and digesting. So the sympathetic division uses the neurotransmitter adrenaline, where the parasympathetic division uses the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. So the sympathetic division is involved with 4 E's, and this is a good way to remember it. It's involved in times of emergency, excitement, embarrassment, or exercise. So both divisions oppose each other because they're trying to maintain homeostasis. So when the sympathetic gets really ramped up, the parasympathetic will chime in and cool you down. So for example, the sympathetic division will accelerate the heart rate and the parasympathetic division will decrease your heart rate. So let's look at the nervous system. So we have our 2 structural divisions, the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is all of the body's nerves. As you can see, they talk to each other quite a bit. So we have in the peripheral nervous system, the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And so the somatic nervous system, you will sense things from the outside environment, and then that information goes to the brain, and then your brain tells you to do something, and then your motor nerves tell your body to do something. So this is under voluntary control. On the flip side, we have the autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary, and it has 2 categories. So the sympathetic will kind of rev your body up, and it talks to the smooth muscle, cardiac muscles, glands, and organs, and also they talk to the nerves, which go to the spinal cord and brain. That revs you up. Parasympathetic is going to cool you down, and it's also talking to your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, and organs, and they are talking to your nerves, brain, and spinal cord. So let's take another look at the nervous system. Okay, looking again at our autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic is going to dilate your pupils, and parasympathetic will constrict them. So sympathetic is times of when you're excited, or anytime your adrenaline would be going. So you don't really want to be digesting then. So it inhibits the things of digestion, like salivation, digestion in the stomach, slows down digestion in the intestines. Whereas the parasympathetic is when you are going to digest. So stimulates salivation, and then stimulates digestion, and also in the intestines. So your heart, maybe you're going to need to run away from something, so it accelerates the heartbeat, dilates the lungs. Over here, this is when you don't need to run away from something, so you have a slow heartbeat. You don't need to dilate your bronchi. And looking here, we know that, again, parasympathetic digestion often happens then. So you're going to stimulate bile release because you're going to be digesting things. And over here, your liver stimulates glucose release so that you have a bunch of glucose in your blood that your cells can pick up because they're going to be maybe fighting a saber-toothed tiger or running away or something like that. And your kidneys are going to be The little adrenal glands above the kidneys are going to be pumping out epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are excitatory hormones. This one relaxes the bladder, this one contracts the bladder. Okay, so let's talk about neurons, the cells of the nervous system. Nervous system cells that make up the brain, the spinal cord, and all your peripheral nerves. And they transmit messages by electrical signals. And here is a drawing of a neuron, and we're going to learn the different parts, the cell body, the dendrite, and the axon. As promised, we're going to learn the parts of the neuron anatomy. First, let's start with the cell body. This is the major part of the cell, and it has the nucleus and all the cytoplasm. Then there are some fibers, some processes that stick out from the cell body. There are two different types. First is the dendrite, and that is a fiber that extends from the neuron cell body, and its job is to receive messages from other neurons. Usually one neuron has many dendrites. These dendrites have receptors for neurotransmitters, which are chemicals released by other neurons, because they receive messages. The other process is the axon. It is also a fiber that extends from the neuron cell body, but this one usually only has one. Each neuron usually only has one axon, and it sends the messages. So it sends the message down the axon via an electrical impulse, and that's away from the cell body towards another neuron. And it sends the electrical impulse to another neuron, a muscle, or a gland. So looking more at the neuron anatomy, we have the synapse, which is the end of the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of the next neuron. And the axon of the first neuron doesn't quite touch the dendrite of the second neuron, so this space is called the synaptic cleft. And the electrical impulse that goes down the axon can't jump across the synaptic cleft, so it has to send a chemical messenger between those two neurons to cross that void, that synaptic cleft. And the chemical messenger is a neurotransmitter. And that's what goes from one neuron to the second neuron. So let's look at some pictures of a neuron. Here we have the cell body and all of the dendrites, and then the axon. And as we can see, these are where the neurotransmitters are going to come out. Up here is a picture of a real neuron with the cell body, the dendrites, and the axon. Let's look at a picture of more neurons. Again, we have our cell body, our dendrites, and our axon. And then the axon looks like it's touching the second neuron, but it is not. It's just, there's a little bitty space there. And we're going to look at that synapse, which is the end of the axon and then the dendrite of the second one. You can see that the signal is going to move this way, neurotransmitter is going to jump there, and then the signal is going to move this way. Okay, so here's a blown up view of that synapse. So we have the end of the axon of one neuron, and we have neurotransmitters that are stored there. And when they get the signal to release them, they release these little neurotransmitters. And then the dendrite of the second neuron have these little receptors for the neurotransmitters, and then they send the message on. Okay, a little bit more about neurons. Neurons can live for your lifetime, so over 100 years. And neurons are different than a lot of other cells because they do not divide, so they cannot replace themselves. There has been some recent studies about neural stem cells, but that is in the beginning stages and we don't know a lot about that. But for your purposes, they don't replace themselves, so you should probably take care of the ones you have. They have a very high metabolic rate, which means they require continuous oxygen and glucose, and they can die within a few minutes without oxygen. In our next video, we're going to learn about different types of neurons. See you then.